Welcome to another deep dive. We're going to be heading to southern India today.
Okay.
Yeah, between 300 and 1200 CE.
All right.
It's a time when those kingdoms were really making waves.
Literally.
Literally, yeah.
Yeah.
With their maritime trade and cultural influence all the way to Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a lot of really interesting sources for this one. Historical texts, archaeological findings,
Wow.
and even chronicles from smaller kingdoms. Should give us a pretty good picture of this really vibrant period.
It's a really fascinating era, I think, especially when you consider the Chola dynasty. They weren't just ruling land, they were masters of the sea.
Ah, so they weren't just about conquering territory.
Right.
Their power was tied to the ocean.
Exactly. Their naval dominance let them control key trade routes across the Bay of Bengal,
Wow.
connecting them to this vast network all the way to Southeast Asia. And it wasn't just military might either. They were savvy diplomats.
Okay,
They made these alliances and trade agreements that gave them a real edge.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
But how do we know all this? What kind of proof do we have that this maritime trade was so important? I mean, this was centuries ago.
Right. Well, one fascinating piece of the puzzle comes from Arikamedu, an archaeological site on the southeastern coast of India.
Okay.
It's believed to be the ancient city of Puduk,
Interesting.
which is mentioned in a Roman text called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea.
Okay.
Basically a guidebook for merchants who were navigating the Indian Ocean.
Oh, wow.
And get this, archaeologists have found Roman pottery there,
Really?
glass beads, and even amphorae.
Wait, amphorae? Like those big clay jars the Romans used to ship wine and olive oil.
Precisely.
What were those doing in India?
It shows just how far these trade networks reach.
Wow.
The Romans really craved exotic goods like spices, textiles, and precious stones from India.
Ah, okay.
They sent their amphorae filled with wine and olive oil eastward, trading them for these really sought-after Indian commodities. It's like the ancient world's globalization.
So even way back then, southern India was plugged into this massive global network, exchanging goods with empires thousands of miles away.
Yeah,
That must have had a huge impact on their economy.
absolutely. This influx of wealth from maritime trade fueled economic prosperity, particularly for kingdoms like the Cholas. Their cities flourished, new industries emerged, and we see this blossoming of art and culture. Think bustling ports,
Yeah.
merchants from all over the world exchanging not just their goods,
Right.
but ideas and stories.
It's amazing to imagine those ships loaded up with spices and silks crossing the Bay of Bengal.
Yeah.
But it wasn't all about economics, was it? What about the cultural side of things? You mentioned Southeast Asia before. What kind of impact did southern India have over there?
That's where things get really interesting. Alongside those ships carrying goods, there were also cultural exchanges happening. Hinduism and Buddhism,
Okay.
which were prominent religions in southern India. They spread to Southeast Asia during this time.
So those sea roads weren't just trade routes, they were cultural highways.
Exactly. And we see evidence of this in the architecture of Southeast Asian temples built during this era. Many of them have elements that are really similar to South Indian temple architecture.
Oh, wow.
It's a clear sign of the cultural exchange that was happening.
Thanks to maritime trade.
Exactly.
But, we've been talking about the Cholas and the Romans, these big players.
Yeah.
What about the smaller kingdoms? Did they get in on the action too?
Absolutely. And we get a fascinating look into their world through documents like the Mushaka Vamshakavya.
Okay.
It's a chronicle from the Malabar region, which is on the southwestern coast of India. This document might seem like a local history project,
Right.
but it tells us a lot about how smaller kingdoms viewed their place in this bigger maritime world. It's interesting. What's fascinating about the Mushaka Vamshakavya is its emphasis on lineage and history, even for a smaller kingdom. It suggests they were really conscious of their place in a world where larger empires like the Cholas dominated the seas.
So even though they weren't a naval superpower,
Right.
they still saw themselves as part of this larger maritime network.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, how did these smaller kingdoms navigate this world?
Right.
Were they competing with the Cholas?
Yeah.
Or did they find other ways to benefit from this maritime trade boom?
It's a good question. I mean, the Cholas had such a powerful navy.
Right.
It's hard to imagine anyone challenging them directly.
Right. Challenging the Cholas head-on probably wasn't the best strategy.
Yeah.
Instead, we see evidence that smaller kingdoms found their own niches in this maritime world.
Okay.
For example, they might have focused on producing specific goods
Okay.
that were in high demand, like particular spices or textiles.
So they played to their strengths.
Yeah.
Specializing in areas where they could compete.
Exactly. And they likely formed alliances
Okay.
with other smaller kingdoms,
Yeah.
creating their own trading networks
Oh.
that might have operated alongside or even within the larger Chola-dominated system.
Interesting. So like a network of smaller streams feeding into a larger river.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
It shows that even in a world dominated by a powerful empire like the Cholas,
Right.
there was still room for smaller players
Yeah.
to thrive and contribute to this overall flow of trade and culture.
That's fascinating. But
Mhm.
speaking of the Cholas, you mentioned earlier that they weren't just about military might.
Right.
What were some of those diplomatic strategies
Yeah.
that helped them build such a vast trading empire?
Well, one key aspect was their ability to forge these strategic alliances
Okay.
with other kingdoms,
Uh-huh.
both in India and Southeast Asia.
Correct.
These alliances weren't just about military cooperation. They were
Yeah.
also about fostering trade and cultural exchange.
So they were playing the long game,
Yeah,
building relationships that would benefit them economically and culturally.
exactly. They understood that a stable and interconnected network was in everyone's best interest. And they used diplomacy to create that network. It wasn't just about making deals. It was about building trust and mutual respect.
So it wasn't just brute force.
Right.
It was about finesse and understanding the cultural landscape.
Absolutely. For instance, the Cholas adopted a policy of religious tolerance,
Okay.
which was crucial in a region with diverse faiths.
Yeah.
This made them more attractive as trading partners
Makes sense.
because merchants from different religious backgrounds
Right.
felt welcomed and safe doing business within their realm.
That's really smart.
Yeah.
They recognized that respecting cultural differences was good for business.
Mm-hmm.
Almost like a lesson in cultural sensitivity from centuries ago.
Right.
But let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about the big picture,
Yeah.
empires, kingdoms, trade routes.
Right.
But what about everyday people?
Yeah.
How did this maritime trade impact their lives?
That's a crucial question. While kings and merchants might have been the main players on the surface, the ripple effects of this maritime trade reached all levels of society.
Wow.
For many people in southern India, it meant new opportunities.
So it wasn't just the elite who benefited.
Not at all. Think about it. This increased trade meant a higher demand
Oops.
for skilled artisans to produce goods for export weavers, potters, metal workers, and more.
Oh, wow.
This created jobs
Hmm.
and boosted local economies,
I-
even in areas far from the major ports.
It's fascinating to think about those connections, how
Yeah.
the demand for spices in Rome
Right,
could create jobs for artisans in a small village in southern India.
precisely. And it wasn't just about producing goods.
Okay.
The maritime trade also created a need for sailors, shipbuilders,
Yeah.
all those who supported this infrastructure of seafaring.
Mm.
It was a whole ecosystem of interconnected activities.
And that ecosystem, fueled by maritime trade,
Right.
had a profound impact on the cultural landscape of southern India.
Yeah.
Right. We talked about the spread of Hinduism and Buddhism to Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
But what about within India itself?
Yeah.
Did this maritime activity lead to any cultural shifts closer to home?
It definitely did. The constant flow of people and ideas through these port cities
Right.
brought about this vibrant mixing of cultures.
Uh-huh.
I see this in the art, music,
Mm-hmm.
and even the cuisine of southern India during this period.
Oh, interesting.
For example, certain spices that became popular in southern Indian cooking
Okay.
were introduced through trade routes from Southeast Asia.
So that delicious curry I had last week
Yeah,
might be a testament to those ancient maritime trade routes.
quite possibly. It's a reminder that even something as seemingly simple as a meal
Right.
can have these deep historical roots,
Wow.
connecting us to a past that's often more interconnected than we realize.
It's amazing to think about how a simple spice could have such a complex story
Right?
about interconnectedness and cultural exchange.
Yeah.
But all these fascinating details that we've been discussing,
Right.
the powerful Cholas,
Yeah.
the Roman trade,
Mm.
the chronicles of those smaller kingdoms.
Right.
They're all pieces of a much larger puzzle, aren't they?
Exactly. Each piece, whether it's a grand inscription on a temple wall
Yeah.
or a humble piece of pottery found at an archaeological site, It all helps us understand this period of southern India's history.
Ah,
It's like weaving a tapestry
right.
where every thread contributes to this overall picture.
And that tapestry reveals a southern India that was vibrant,
Yeah.
outward-looking, and deeply engaged with the world beyond its shores. It makes me wonder, what if things had gone differently?
Oh, interesting.
What if the Cholas hadn't been so successful?
Yeah.
Or if those maritime routes had been disrupted?
Right.
How would that have changed the course of history, both for southern India and Southeast Asia?
That's a fascinating question to think about.
Yeah.
Given how influential southern India was in this era, any change to their maritime dominance would have had ripple effects throughout the region.
Wow.
Imagine, for example, if their navy hadn't been as strong.
Or if they hadn't been as skilled at diplomacy.
Yeah.
It's very possible that the cultural landscape of Southeast Asia would look totally different today.
It's like a butterfly effect, right?
Yeah.
A small change in one place can lead to these huge changes elsewhere.
Exactly. And that's what makes history so intriguing.
Yeah.
We can trace these connections and think about those what-if scenarios.
Yeah.
And through that, we gain a much deeper appreciation for the complexity of the past
Wow.
and how it shaped the present.
Right. It reminds us that the world we live in today is a product of countless decisions and events that have happened over centuries.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, I think we've navigated our way through the fascinating world of southern India's maritime past.
Right.
We've seen how seafaring brought about economic prosperity, sparked cultural exchange, connected southern India to this vast network spanning continents.
It's a story of ambition, ingenuity, and cultural exchange that continues to resonate with us even today. And just like those ancient ships loaded up with spices and silks,
Right.
we've journeyed across time,
Yeah.
uncovering stories and insights that I hope leave you with a deeper understanding of this remarkable period.
Absolutely.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the rich tapestry of history.
I agree.
Until next time.